Hi, Russ of Aquarimax Pets here. Porcellio dilatatus giant canyon is the subject of today's isopod species profile. I'll introduce the giant canyon, then discuss its housing and care, its use in bioactive vivaria, and finally its potential as a pet or hobby pod. The species Porcellio dilatatus is naturally found in Europe, but was introduced into North America some centuries ago. According to the book Isopod Zoology, a friend of Orin McMonigle's collected some specimens of this species in a canyon in the state of California. The specimens from this locality tended to be particularly large for the species, hence the name Giant Canyon. The descendants of this stock in the hobby today are sometimes incorrectly referred to as Grand Canyon isopods, but the last time I checked, the Grand Canyon was still in Arizona. Before the large Spanish Porcellio species like Porcellio expansus or Porcellio hoffmannseggi came into the hobby some years ago, the giant canyon was one of the largest species in the hobby. While that is certainly no longer true, it's still a good-sized isopod with a wide and stocky build. It can reach over 3/4 of an inch in length, but it might take a couple of years and plenty of space to achieve that size. Though there is some natural variation in color in this species, there are not any widespread, well-established morphs that I'm aware of. I've heard of a peach morph, but I haven't actually seen it. And a hobbyist found a pure white individual a number of years ago, but unfortunately, it did not produce any descendants of the same color. I've heard indications of interesting specimens popping up here and there, so if you happen to know of any morphs, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Porcellio dilatatus can reproduce quite quickly. When I ordered my original stock from Orin McMonigle years ago, I received a number of adults and some bonus munci right in the shipping container, and soon I had quite a lot of giant canyons. With plenty of food and space, these are fast breeders. I'd probably be up to my eyeballs in giant canyons if they didn't sell so well. Before I get into the care for this species, I'd like to thank my patrons at Patreon. I really enjoy making videos and sharing what I've learned with everyone here on YouTube. Making videos does take a lot of time, effort, and resources though, and my patrons help make it possible for me to continue making educational videos like this one. I also try to give back to patrons with various perks. If you'd like to see what I offer on Patreon, or you'd like to help out for as little as $1 per month, please click the link at the end of the video or in the description. Now, on to care for the giant canyon isopod, which is really pretty easy. First, I want to mention something about substrate. Giant canyons really dig it. And I mean that both in a literal and figurative sense. Literally, in that the giant canyon is a burrower, so it appreciates some substrate depth. At least 2 inches are good, and 3 or 4 inches would be even better. When I say they dig their substrate in a figurative sense, I mean that giant canyon isopods like to eat a lot of their base substrate, more so than your average isopod. If you've never worked with an isopod that is a heavy substrate feeder, you'll be surprised at how quickly the giant canyons will turn the entire base substrate into frass. So plan on changing the substrate a little more often with this species than with many other isopods. For more information on how to change the substrate, you can check out my video up here. Now let's talk ventilation. Porcellio dilatatus is tolerant of low ventilation, but it does fine with high ventilation as well. It's probably safest and easiest to go with moderate ventilation for this species in most cases. That way, the substrate doesn't dry out too fast, and yet the moderate airflow can help reduce issues with mold. Giant canyons, like all terrestrial isopods, need a hydration station, which can easily be furnished by adding a pile of damp sphagnum moss on one side of the enclosure and never letting it dry out. This species is quite tolerant of dry substrate in the rest of the enclosure, but they also do well if the substrate is somewhat moist throughout. Just don't let it get soggy. Cork bark and other hides should be offered and will be used, but a large number of your giant canyons will just burrow down into that substrate. Feeding giant canyons is easy. They're not picky isopods, but they often tend to prefer to eat under cover of darkness. This tendency is reduced as the population increases. And they can sometimes be coaxed right out of the substrate when they smell a snack. These hungry isopods crave protein-rich foods as well as vegetables. There's very little that they won't eat. Giant canyons are fairly tolerant of a wide range of temperatures. Room temperatures between 65 and 80 Fahrenheit suit them just fine. If you stick to basic isopod care, you really can't go wrong with Porcellio dilatatus. So, how do giant canyon isopods do in a bioactive cleanup crew? Well, their hardy and adaptable nature makes them a pretty good candidate with species that are not particularly sensitive. They can do well in fairly arid enclosures, as long as access to a hydration station is provided, as I mentioned before. Some people use them successfully with bearded dragons, for example. They can also thrive in much more humid enclosures. They're somewhat secretive, and their burrowing nature can help prevent them from being eliminated if you keep them with diurnal predators. So I'd say that giant canyons have a lot going for them as biocustodians. However, with very soft-skinned vertebrates or vulnerable invertebrates, I might hesitate to use giant canyons. They do have very robust appetites. It's always good to do some research to determine which is the best isopod species for your particular situation. And finally, how is Porcellio dilatatus as a pet or display isopod? Well, as I mentioned before, giant canyons were once sought after for their impressive size, but there are now a good number of isopod species in the hobby that are much larger. They're really not too remarkable in appearance. The wild type coloration does vary a little, but they're mostly just your standard gray isopod, extra wide. They don't win any prizes for daytime activity levels either. A large, well-established colony of giant canyons has a strong feeding response, and that's certainly fun to see. However, with a smaller colony, you might not see your isopods much, as giant canyons spend a lot of time burrowed under the substrate. You notice a theme here? Especially during the day, so they're really just not the best display isopods, especially since their immediate reaction when you lift up a piece of bark or other hide is to just scatter. I maintained a culture in a 6-quart tub for years, and I only ever saw a small number of them when I opened the container, unless I looked for them in the substrate, and then I was usually surprised by how many there were down there. I only recently upgraded to the 16-quart tub, so right now it seems fairly sparsely populated. Until the colony grows substantially, there isn't going to be a lot of activity in here. In short, these are not really great isopods for display, especially in a low culture density. In short, a large colony of giant canyons can be impressive, but if you're looking for a really big isopod, check out my video on Porcellio hoffmannseggi. If you're looking for a really active isopod that also reaches a decent size, check out my video on Porcellio laevis. In conclusion, Porcellio dilatatus is a hardy isopod that can be a good choice for some bioactive setups, but if you're looking for a display isopod, there are better options out there. Thanks for watching today. I post videos every Friday with live streams on Wednesdays, all on aquarium and vivarium pets, with lots of videos on isopods. Please feel free to rate, share, comment, and if you haven't already,
subscribe.
And then tap the bell for notifications all so you don't miss my next video.